Hello and welcome to another episode of Language Therapy with Dr. K, a podcast from the USC Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies. My guest today is Dr. Hratch Tchilingirian, sociologist, author, and innovation executive. He is currently the Director of Institutional Innovation at the Western Diocese of the Armenian Church. He has had many lives. He has taught in some of the most prestigious institutions across the globe, including the University of Cambridge, University of Oxford. Currently, he's an associate professor at INALCO in Paris. He has authored numerous articles and monographs on issues of identity, of migration, of Christian minorities in the Middle East. But the project that we centered in this conversation was his role as the director of the Armenian Diaspora Survey, a global public opinion inquiry that spanned 10 countries, multiple diaspora communities to understand their attitudes, their views, their opinions on important issues like identity, like language and culture, like religion, Armenia, and more. And of course, since this is language therapy, we did a deep dive on the language dynamics and what the Armenian Diaspora Survey says about the role of language in Armenian identity, about diasporans' engagement and opinions of educational institutions, and universals across diaspora communities and particular nuances for specific communities. So join us in a wonderful conversation, and I hope you find it as exciting as I did. Dr. Hratch Tchilingirian, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
I'm going to start with my traditional question, which is, could you tell me the story of your life through your languages?
That's quite, I think, loaded question, but let me try to give you an idea. Starting with, I was born in Beirut, Lebanon, so my first language was Armenian. I went to Armenian school. At home, we spoke Armenian to a point that we had very little interaction with the Arabic language other than when we went to for shopping and so on and so forth. Even though later on in my early teens, I had neighborhood friends who were Arabic-speaking, Lebanese. So my Arabic obviously was fluent. But in school, we were taught in Armenian and then in Arabic and English. So we had different subjects in three languages, like math in Armenian and in Arabic. English was mostly language. But then when in the fifth grade, we had French for 1 year. So we grew up with these 3-4 languages.
But this is quite typical, right, for the Lebanese Armenian experience, particularly of your generation.
Yeah.
To have had this really immersive experience in Armenian, though in a diaspora community, and then pick up Arabic later, and then a couple of other languages, typically English and French.
Yeah, exactly. But also we had the dialects, the parpar. My mother's side, they're from Hajan, so my grandparents spoke the Hajan dialect within the family. So we heard this, and I could understand fully. I couldn't speak it other than, rudimentary, but I could fully understand. And from my father's side, they were Kesaptsi. So they spoke the Kesap dialect when there were family gatherings. And so I also grew up with the dialects. So the Armenian was very diverse. It was Western Armenian, obviously, but also the dialects were kind of, now when I look back, kind of added ingredients that made it a richer experience, I would say, now as an adult when I think about it.
But what was your awareness as a young person of the language you were being taught at school and then these dialects you were hearing at home? And also did Turkish play a role? Was Turkish present?
Yeah, exactly. These were initially, they were the secret language that our parents use when they didn't want us to understand. So the Turkish, I was introduced, and my generation, we were introduced to Turkish as the secret language, but it was used often enough that we started to understand. But also, there was a generation of my grandparents' generation who came from Cilicia, and some were Turkish-speaking, not their dialect, but they spoke Turkish. So we were exposed in the neighborhood or different Armenian spaces through our interactions. When you're walking with your mom, she stops and talks to Gidean, and they're talking in Turkish. So you hear this conversation and you get the gist of it. But later on, when I started to go to Turkey for research and visit, it kind of it came back, and I built on this childhood memory of the language. And now I can manage to speak, rudimentary level.
So it was dormant. It was dormant, yeah. But once you were immersed again.
Yeah.
And then what about after school, after secondary school? Where did you go to study, and what languages came along with that process?
So because of the civil war in Lebanon, I went to Jerusalem, where basically I finished my secondary school, the high school, as it were, in Jerusalem, where obviously we used Armenian, but also Arabic, because we were in East Jerusalem, the shops, and we had interaction with the Palestinians. But we also took Hebrew, modern Hebrew classes in the seminary, because Jerusalem was part of Israel and there were interactions. So we started learning Hebrew, but unfortunately not as, I wasn't fluent. But because it was also close to Arabic, it was easier for me to converse whenever is needed, kind of manage to say something. But obviously, in my kind of perception, languages have been more like utilitarian kind of tools, where because of the circumstances or the kind of life you're in, you use these languages as a practical thing, not as, this cultural immersion and philosophical understanding of other cultures. So you just do it because you have to, get on with life.
Well, that's why in applied linguistics and sociolinguistics, there's this term circumstantial bilingual or circumstantial multilingual. And it's interesting because over the years of teaching courses, so many students won't raise their hand when I ask if they're bilingual. And yet I know they are, because they always define bilingualism as this like elite or symbolic bilingualism, when in reality, most of the world picks up languages precisely for the reasons you just described, to meet their everyday needs, to manage through life. So that's fascinating.
Yeah, and as we know, a lot of people don't learn languages in schools. It's just natural because you're in the environment. But also, I think about it that, at least in my experience, that your brain as if is overloaded and you have to delete these files in order to put new knowledge, new languages, or new tools. So I feel that also the practical dimension, that the brain as if it were a computer, you come to a point where you have to delete things.
Or maybe archive.
Yeah, archive, yes. That's memory.
Yes.
Memory is archive.
Yes.
But even that, you then, because of the space, in inverted commas, you pick which memories, which archives to keep and which to delete. Delete not in the sense that, they're not important, but they're not a priority in your RAM, as it were.
It's so
There's
funny.
somewhere there.
I've been using that metaphor recently very frequently when I'm talking to my colleagues or I'm talking to my mother, for example, and I'll say my brain's at capacity and I have to file things away or exactly like you said, delete certain things so that I have room for the things that are most urgent on my list or that I need today to solve the problems of today.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. Okay, so we went from Lebanon to Jerusalem, and then what was the next?
Yeah, and then U.S. I came to U.S. and did my undergraduate degree here in New York at Concordia College. While I was also at St. Ignatius Armenian Seminary continuing theological studies. But in order to do my master's, I had to complete my bachelor's. So for 2 years, I took intensive courses. I was supposed to go for 3 years, but I did it in 2 years, got my bachelor's in English because I thought, my English was very broken or rudimentary when I came. I was 20 years old. I thought I would be forced if I made my major English. There's a lot of reading on a weekly basis. You have to read books and literature. So that kind of accelerated the process of me getting really immersed in English literature, American literature, British literature, Shakespeare, and so on. It was difficult, but I would say that it put the foundation for my language skills in English. And I would say, as a result, as we know, your higher education language is how you start thinking philosophically and about concepts. So my thinking also started to be in English as opposed to Armenian. And it was only later, maybe when I was in my 40s, that I started to write in Armenian again. But for a couple of decades, I was thinking in English. I was writing only in English or lecturing in English. But then it came back, or there was a desire for me to also think and write in Western Armenian as well.
But was that intentional on your end to bring back Armenian? Was that was it a philosophical decision? Was it a strategic decision to produce interesting and intellectual content in Armenian? How did that need come about?
I think it was a combination. One was, again, maybe going back, sort of, it's part of my biography, so it's there. But also, I think language is also a way of thinking. So even now, when I publish recently, a couple of weeks ago, I published an article in Western Armenian on the diaspora and leadership. At least from my point of view, there are certain subjects, certain issues that you have to think in that language. And then when you speak about it, you don't have to do too much explanation because it's understood within the frame of that, the logic of that language. So to me, writing in Western Armenian has this dynamic, has this kind of interesting, that certain issues I'd like to speak or write or discuss in Armenian because, like I said, the issue itself has Armenian ingredients as opposed to, wider societal issues. They're particularly Armenian issues or problems.
That's interesting. I kept thinking about the word lezva metazoğություն.
Yes.
Even that particular word is hard to translate into English, right? How the way language shapes the way you think. You need a whole sentence and maybe a couple of follow-ups. But also, interestingly, I completely understand what you're saying. Sometimes I will challenge myself or my students to do the opposite. The things that you are used to writing about or thinking in Armenian, let's reverse that. Because a lot of times students come with certain preconceived notions that you need to use Armenian only for things Armenian. And then we'll challenge that and say, write about love, light, the sky, whatever, things that you don't necessarily associate with Armenian.
Yeah. But also, I think, at least from my perspective, when I'm writing in Armenian, I have a particular audience, as it were, that I'm speaking to. And that's mostly, the institutional thinking, the people who've been in our institutions for 30, 40, 50 years. So, and there is a certain
shared context,
but also room for dialogue and discussion and critique. So the language helps because we have to speak in the language that they're using and engage within that frame of conceptual framing that they do. So I also take notice or consider that when I'm writing, because I know that a certain audience is going to read Western Armenian newspapers or an article that's, 3, 4, or 5 pages as opposed to, 300-word something in English. So I think as academics, as intellectuals, we address different audiences with our intellectual production or thinking. And I find that Western Armenian today, it's an endangered language, as we hear all the time in the last, a decade or so. So there are all these strands that the language brings together, not only as a tool of communication, but, as you say, the philosophy, the conceptual, the argumentation, the framing, and so on.
Absolutely. I wanted to ask about the seminary. What type of linguistic exposure did you have there? What role did classical Armenian play? And also, I'm so curious at what point you were introduced to Eastern Armenian, or where was Eastern Armenian in your consciousness? Now, at this point in your biography, you're like thrice diasporan.
Yeah.
So we've had Lebanon, we've had Jerusalem, now we've had the U.S. Where are we now in your linguistic profile?
Yeah. I mean, in seminary in Jerusalem, like I said, we were introduced to classical Armenian, Karapad, which I continued, and I'm conversant in reading and understanding, obviously, not speaking. It's not a spoken language. But also in the U.S., when I did my Master of Divinity, I took classical Greek for liturgy as a liturgical language. So there was another dimension there, a new alphabet, different alphabet to learn, and at least learn the theological and biblical language. So yet another tool, again, the practical aspect of it. But in terms of Eastern Armenian, I think I was in my diasporic experience, as it were, I was exposed to Eastern Armenian through Barskahais. So in the diaspora, not in Lebanon, because in Lebanon nobody thought of the Barskahais or the Hayastansis. Everything was Western Armenian. But at least in the Western diaspora, when you go to Europe or the United States, you are exposed to various languages and dialects. So that was my first introduction. Obviously, we were exposed to Eastern Armenian in school through the poetry, not the orthography, obviously, but we read, Tumanian and
Gidean.
Yeah, Badur Sevag and so on. So we were familiar with the language, and it sounded like this, oh, beautiful, it's much more beautiful and poetic. And now in Ayastan, they say, oh, Western Armenian is so poetic.
I was going to say the exact same thing. I remember when I was first exposed to Western Armenian here in Los Angeles, everything sounded poetic to me. Even I would ask my friends, like, could you curse in Western Armenian? And they would say something. I was like, oh, that's so romantic. It sounds so poetic.
Yeah.
So interesting how perceptions are formed of the other. And then how did you end up in England? Because I know that's another major point space for you.
It's a long story, but the short of it is that until the age of 32, I was thinking about becoming a priest in the Armenian church, married priest. So I was also the dean of St. Ignatius Seminary in New York for 3 years. But I always wanted to do my PhD, continue both in terms of, because I was in an academic environment, but also personally. I always valued further education. So I went to London School of Economics to study with a professor who's a well-known expert on sociology of religion, Eileen Barker. So I went to LSE to do my PhD, and then my whole trajectory changed because immediately after I graduated, defended my doctorate, I got a position at Cambridge University in the Judge Business School.
You know, just one of the best universities in the world.
So I went into, at the time, what was Eurasian studies, Caspian, pipeline, Baku-Ceyhan pipeline, should they build it, not build it? So this is like in the late 90s and early 20s. So did a lot of the geopolitics and economic kind of developments. But then after 10 years, I kind of went back to my passion of Armenian studies, philological studies, modern, focusing on contemporary and modern Armenian studies. And that's when I went to Oxford in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, working with Professor Theo van Lint, who is the chair of Armenian Studies. So there, I kind of, during those 10 years, I came back into diaspora studies because that's also my passion, not only because of my personal experience, but also it involves a lot of the dimensions of being Armenian, primarily, starting with identity, with the issue of identity, because diaspora is all about identity at the end of the day.
Yep. I have so many questions I want to ask about the few sentences you just shared, but I think we have to archive those for later episodes, and I'm sure we'll have you back because I want to ask about the seminary. I want to ask about Cambridge, Oxford. I feel like you've lived so many lives because just in preparation, I was looking at all of your publications. I was like, we could talk about Karabakh. We could talk about religion. We could talk about Christian minorities in the Middle East. But what I want to talk about today and center in your very rich and varied production is the Armenian Diaspora Survey, which very few people know about, at least in the larger public. I think in the academic world, those of us who know have been using it as such an amazing resource. Actually, just the student worker who helps me with research for this podcast, I gave her the reports and she was like, I can't believe something like this exists. Yeah. So before I share more, I'd like to ask you, what is the Armenian Diaspora Survey and how and why was it conceived?
The Armenian Diaspora Survey is a research project, or was and is, so hopefully it will continue, which was initiated by the Armenian Communities Department of the Kalis Gulbenkian Foundation with under kind of the guidance of Razmik Panosyan, who's the director of the Armenian communities. So at the end of 2017, Razmik brought together about 20 of us who are doing diaspora studies, who had published or are doing some research. We gathered in London just to kind of have a conversation about where do we go in terms of diaspora studies. So through that initial conversation, we had a couple of follow-ups. And that's where the idea of this diaspora survey took shape. And we formed a committee of about 15 scholars, including Hratch Tchilingirian, Ani Bakalyan, and so on, people who have deep knowledge about the diaspora, but also people, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists, who have done research, had done field work and so on. So as a result, we came up with a plan to survey the diaspora, but initially we didn't know how to go about it because this was this huge undertaking. So initially in 2018, we did a pilot project, relatively small scale, in 4 places: Cairo, Pasadena, in Marseille, and Boston. We had about 1,000 people who took part in it. But the questionnaire was like 100 questions. It was too long, and the fatigue of response and so on. So we learned a lot from that experience, not only to shorten the questionnaire, but also how to organize. So in 2019, I was asked to direct this project. So it was a huge challenge to do it throughout the diaspora.
How important was your training and background as a sociologist to your role as a director? And could you address how important the methodological approach was? Because the Armenian diaspora is a global thing. There are Armenians all over the world. So if one wants to understand the attitudes, the trends, the experiences of a people spread across the globe, this is something I would pose to my students in a class discussion. How would you go about studying this? What research methodologies would you use? Would you use quantitative? Would you use qualitative? What does one bring? What does the other add? So I'm so curious, if one were a fly in those discussions you were having with this diverse array of scholars, what were some of the debates you had or the conversations you had about how to design this study, and how important was your particular methodological expertise?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very good question, and there are a number of dimensions to it. But originally, the pilot, when was done, it was thought of more like an ethnography, to do like this. The interviews were deeper ethnographic questioning, it could go hours, to collect photos and map neighborhoods where Armenians live and so on and so forth. It was very interesting. But when we were going to do the real research, I realized that we have so many challenges to do that. Starting the most basic thing. You cannot send people to a country for 3 months, experts who are experts on diaspora, methodology, everything, who would know the language, know the community, and so on. So I thought that this is not going to work unless we have, millions and millions to. Secondly, to find the people who would do it for 3 months, field work, because they have their own positions, they have their own jobs.
So let's define fieldwork for any who may not know. Fieldwork is a term in the social sciences that an expert actually goes to whatever community, whatever location they're studying, and spends meaningful time immersed in that community.
Yes.
So this requires a scholar, a professor, to leave their everyday job and dedicate 3 months or however long is necessary to go and build that kind of data collection in that community.
Exactly. And obviously, studying diaspora has its own challenges, which I will come, but to continue on the fieldwork. So I thought that we need to hire local scholars who know the language, who know the society, they know the community, and they have the expertise. I mean, it was a challenge, but we found in all 10 countries. So obviously, we didn't decide on all countries from the beginning, but we were doing 4 countries at a time, and we did it in 3 cycles over 3-year cycle, with the exception of the COVID and the lockdown. We kind of postponed it by 1 year. So I would go to each country where we are going to do the survey, spend some time to find these scholars, but also in each country, we would set up a local advisory committee. Again, people who know the community, they are leaders or academics or influencers, whatever, so they could help us with issues that we might confront during the research. They could help us with networking and so on. So that was very important. And the other important, so we had the researchers locally, local advisory board, and most importantly, I think, we work with all the community organizations. And this was the most difficult part for my job, because as we know, some don't talk to each other, or there is a trust issue. But also this, speaking of trust, they would ask me, why are you doing this? What are you going to do with the data? And so I had to kind of explain and put them in comfort that this is useful for them as well, because they're going to learn about their own community.
But I think here maybe it's important to note that no such endeavor had been attempted. We kept talking about the Armenian diaspora, singular, and we can talk about that too, as if it's one monolith. And I think this survey was a great intervention. But there were no large-scale studies of this kind. So I'm not surprised that people were taken aback, or maybe apprehensive, or simply curious to understand what are the objectives of this type of an investigation.
I think trust is very important. I found that it's the first kind of element to have this trust by the people you are going to study, that you're not exploiting them, that you're respectful, and you know the parameters, that this is scientific approach. It's not, a colloquial thing. So, but also when you ask, my personal involvement with this, my personal network and knowledge of communities and people, I would say in some communities were critical. In some small communities, if I didn't know the key players, we wouldn't have been able to do it. But when they said, okay, we trust you and let's do it, so the doors were opened. So there's also that when you say, when you study, I'm sure in your own experience, you have a lot of knowledge and network of people that if you say it, people are willing because they trust your professional standing and so on. But when it comes to diaspora, methodologically speaking, we cannot use the conventional methods that are used in social sciences. One of the key issues here is the sampling and representation. And this is a question that I'm asked all the time, that how do you get your sample? Traditionally or conventionally, there are methods. You go through, DMV list or some kind of the census. You know where people live and what they do. But with the Armenian community, we don't have census. We don't know where everyone lives. We have the organizations, but there are a lot more who are not part of the organizations.
Exactly.
So that doesn't work. The traditional or conventional sampling doesn't work. Representation is an issue which people ask. A lot of people think that it's a matter of numbers. If you have 100,000, then it's good. But as we know, again, in social sciences, it doesn't. In the U.S., for instance, the magic number is 1,036 or something like that. If you have 1,000 people, you get the public opinion. So it's not the numbers. This was initially a question that we really battled with, and we spent a lot of time on this issue. And we explained in our methodology that there are limitations and issues. But what I noticed that at the end of the whole cycle, when we did in 10 countries, in over 50 communities, by the way, because in each country there are people in different. The ADS data as if produce its own validity mechanism. Because you see in a range of questions, it's the same answer or the percentage, whether it's in Romania, in Los Angeles, or in Lebanon. So in a way, the representativeness is there. Again, I'm not saying it's 100%, but at least we have something. Hopefully in coming years it could be improved, but I believe that what we produced is quite reliable. I don't want to go into details of the other methodologies.
I think we don't need to. I think every study has its limitations. It's important to acknowledge them head on, address them, and move on. I am very curious before we jump into results from the study and particularly the language dynamics. So it's called the Armenian Diaspora Survey. Could we discuss how you defined Armenian and how you defined diaspora, even in the title of this study? Was there a discussion on how do we define who is Armenian, what is Armenian, to even solicit participation, and how do you define? You can take this personally, or you can take this as the director of the Armenian Diaspora Survey. How do you define diaspora?
Very simple. In the introduction to our questionnaire, we say, if you consider yourself Armenian, take this survey. That's it. So today in the 21st century, again, the ADS results support what I'm going to say, is how you define yourself. If you say that you are Armenian, then you are Armenian. It's not like this. Maybe 50 years ago, there was a certain definition that you have to be this, this, this. I think we're beyond that. If you say you're Armenian, then you're Armenian. That's my definition, and this is what our research showed.
I love it.
Yeah.
I love it. Mm-hmm. That's my definition as well.
By the way, we even had a category in the first question of ABC, Armenian by choice. Mm-hmm. And there was a very small, I think 1% in the 13,000, but still, we had that category.
Yes, and that category exists.
Yeah.
And how do you define diaspora?
Diaspora for the survey was basically the dispersed communities throughout the world. That was our kind of the subject matter.
Mm-hmm. What again, in the methodological discussions, what was the conversation around what language will the survey be administered in, or how many languages to offer?
Yeah, from the very beginning, we decided that we are going to deploy the questionnaire in all the languages that a particular community speaks. So in all, I would say minimum, there were 4 languages in each of the countries. So in Argentina, we had it in Spanish, Armenian, Western Armenian, Eastern Armenian. In Canada, in Montreal, we also had it in Arabic, because there is a community from Syria who have considerable number, and we wanted to include them as well. We had it in Turkish, surprisingly maybe for you, for Paris, because there is a Bol Sahay or Turkish Armenian community in Paris, even though there were minimal use of that. But nevertheless, we made the effort to. So overall, we had it in 10 languages, the questionnaire, and we did it very systematically, the translation, to make it sure that it reflects the cultural understanding of the terminology. So we had 2 independent translators of the questionnaire, and a third person would adjudicate, to make the final judgment whether to use this term or that term.
This is what makes me excited.
Yes.
This stuff is so important.
Yeah.
When we were doing My Armenian Story, the crowdsourced oral history project, which also is a Gulbenkian supported project, these were discussions we were having, how important it was for us to have it in both Armenians, first of all, just as a symbolic, philosophical, but also practical tool to make sure we capture the Hayastansi diaspora, for example, and so on, but also to have all of the other languages represented to make sure that we are reaching people. And I think something you said is so critically important, that regardless of which community you go into, coming back to this idea of diaspora, there are second diasporas, third diasporas, people who have been uprooted and have moved multiple times in one lifetime and bring their sociolinguistic profile with them. So just because they're living in an English or French-speaking country today doesn't mean necessarily that is the language they prefer, or that is their dominant language, and that's where you'll capture them.
And even when you translate, again, going back to earlier, what we were talking about, this lezvan mdadzogutun, the logic, as it were, of the language. Here also we see that even those who consider themselves fluent speakers of Armenian, we noticed that they took the survey in English. And I want to give you a couple of examples. I was shocked maybe in Lebanon, because, Western Armenian is the mother diaspora community and all that, we have this impression. But in Lebanon, 47% completed the questionnaire in English, and only 40% completed it in Western Armenian in Lebanon.
Wow.
Yeah. And to give you another, in the U.S., we had nearly 8,000 people who completed the questionnaire. Only 6% combined Western and Eastern Armenian. Only 6% completed it in Armenian. In the meanwhile, when we ask how fluent do you consider your Armenian, in the U.S., they say 52% say I'm fluent in Armenian, but only 6%. So as a linguist, I think you know much more about this, the difference between the spoken language as opposed to written and reading and writing in Armenian. We're talking about 2 different things. And as some linguists say, that it's the spoken language that keeps the language vital as opposed to the written? I'm sure this is your domain.
You're anticipating some of my questions, which were, so the main methodology, because I know there's a qualitative portion too, right? In addition to these questionnaires which were administered, there were also interviews which were conducted for depth. But in any case, we are seeking their opinions and their perceptions, right? It's not like, particularly when it comes to language proficiency, because this is where I work in, when you ask someone their perception of their own language their own language fluency, it's so fascinating to see how well they think they speak or how poorly they think they speak. By the way, it can go on either extreme. And then as a competent person in that language, sometimes your own objective or semi-objective assessment is quite different from their own perception. So that's something I wanted to ask about, is perceptions of fluency. But before we get there, just so we can set the scene. So 2018, we have a pilot, 2019, 2021, 2022, skipping the COVID year. We have 3 more years. And in this process of basically 4 attempts, including the pilot, the Armenian Diaspora Survey covers 10 countries. Around 13,000 people are surveyed with some 400 long-form interviews. Could you really quickly give us a sense of the geographic range? So you mentioned Argentina, you mentioned Boston. Could we get a comprehensive sense of how many communities were targeted?
Yeah. Before I go there, I also want to mention that this is an important aspect, that we were able to engage over 500 people in this project. When I went to different countries, if I put together the committees, the scholars, the translators, the organizational help, and everyone together, it's more than 500 people. So that's the level or the kind of the depth of work that required, and otherwise you cannot do this, with, a dozen or so people. You need a large engagement with a lot of different talents, people in position and interest, and so on.
I'm trying to think if I know of any study of that scale, and I can't think of one. And I think I'm so happy you're mentioning this, because in case there's a young scholar or a student thinking about going into research, it's so important to have these models and to get to pull back the curtains and see the process behind the scenes.
Yes.
How important a personal network is. I'm so happy you brought that up. How important trust is. How important it is to respect the local community and win them over, make them stakeholders instead of simple objects or subjects of a study. So that's really
if
a
I
stunning
may
number.
Interject another, in parentheses, another thing. This is why I consider it's very important that we as scholars, as researchers, as intellectuals, we have to engage with our communities. Not only when we want to do research, when we want to use them as a subject matter, but in between, how are we sharing our knowledge? How are we contributing to our community life? Because that process builds the bridges that you might need later on, or if people have issues, they might refer to you, or they come. So I think this is something we as scholars, a lot of times we forget, that it's not just sitting in the ivory tower, to use a cliche, but you have to be on the street. And I'm very much a believer in that. The empirical dimension of everything we do is critical.
Absolutely. I could not agree with you more. And I think even in the Institute, we have our 3 pillars, which is research, education, and public engagement, which is an equal third, not an afterthought. Because but interestingly enough, when I was coming of age as a graduate student, I had my wrist slapped for thinking about that. The norm was, You are an objective observer. You stay in the ivory tower. You make your observations, and that's it. And I'm hopeful that things have changed. So now you're not an outcast when you think about or say things like research with consequence or applied research or even co-construction of knowledge. This has been a term in the social sciences, right? Where with the community, with the people you are studying, you are co-constructing knowledge. It's not you studying them as this exotic species.
Yeah.
So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah. Especially in the social sciences, like you said, you have to be engaged. Social is the society, social science.
Yes.
You bring the science to society.
Yes.
In that aspect.
And also this type of engagement may inspire community members to go into scholarship, to go into research, because that's another major problem we have is explaining what a research institute does, explaining what a researcher's activities look like. I think that's another very important area to consider.
And also as social scientists, just like medical sciences, right? They are educated and they work to resolve problems in people's lives. We are called to help people, because I'm sure you had experience and I have experience. People ask, we have this problem. You're an expert. You've done a study. What should we do? How can we resolve this? So they expect us also to play a role as doctors in the social sciences for societal community issues. And because we've spent the time and the energy to study, so we could say, what you're going through or what you have is this. Here is the issue. Resolve that. So I think there is also, it's like a two-way street. You also get satisfaction that the work you're doing has an impact, has relevancy, and it's not just, to be published in a journal and put on a shelf.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the privileges of doing contemporary Armenian studies, right? Because we are studying communities which are living, which are in flux, which have real problems, and you can offer solutions or at least guide based on your research. I even have people approaching me for like family language practices, policies in schools and so on. And as you said, these are real issues that institutions, individuals, families, communities are facing. And these bridges are undeniably important and helpful. But going back to the diaspora survey, what countries, what communities, what was the scope across the years?
This was also a question that we had to deal with. So let me say a few kind of strategies that we use. First, we wanted to include small size communities, mid-size, and large communities. So we wanted to make sure that we have this variety. Secondly, we wanted geographic diversity. So we did Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Middle East, South America, North America. So we had a nice kind of range there of the variety, including the sizes. And the third consideration, at least from my point of view, whether we could work with the local community and whether we could find the experts, the scholars that we need. There were some communities where we couldn't, or I wasn't sure that we will be successful, so we didn't do those communities. And there were some communities that was dangerous to do. For instance, we would have wanted to do it in Syria or Iran, but they had other complications for this kind of a research, or Turkey even. So that was also another practical, whether we could find partners and people that we can work with. So these three were part of our thinking.
Mm-hmm. What was, as you said in the very beginning, diaspora is all about identity. Was one of the aims of this survey to find out what the ingredients of that identity are? And if so, as a researcher, you always have a hypothesis hidden, whether you share it or not. And then it's quite exhilarating to see your hypothesis either validated or completely dismantled.
Yeah.
I'm curious on kind of a large scale, if you had a hypothesis and how the overall survey results, what did they have to say about Armenian identity and the core ingredients? If there are some, and if those are universal, I guess.
I think the survey at least did two things. One, it confirmed a lot of our assumptions, because until, the hard numbers, we assume, like you said, you had the hypotheses. We thought that these are the issues. So it confirms a lot of that. For instance, the fact that the highest they identify as hyphenated Armenians. This is the highest percent of people who identify, along with their local identity. So it's Armenian American, or French of Armenian descent, or Argentinian Armenian, or Armenian of Argentina, so Romanian Armenian. So this was the largest percent of identification.
So when you asked people, how do you self-identify, the choices were Armenian?
We gave them a list that they would pick, and there were like 6 or 7 choices, and they would tick.
And the highest was a hyphenated identity.
Yeah,
that
combined. For instance, let's say American Armenian or Armenian American. So if you combine all the combinations of hyphenation, then you have the highest number. Nearly like 6. I don't have the number now, but about 60%. It's about 40% who say just Armenian. I've said Armenian. Now, this brings another nuance to this question. For instance, in Belgium, there is high number of Armenian speaking and being identified as high Armenian, not Belgian Armenian, because the community is largely Hayastansi.
Yes, I was going to say.
And they don't consider, Hayastansis don't consider themselves a Spirkahai. A Spirkahai is us, the traditional, the classical Spirk. So they might be in the diaspora for 30 years. They're not Spirkahai. They are the others. So in this sense, it's interesting that those who came to the diaspora from Armenia identify primarily themselves as Armenian.
But I think I absolutely have noticed the same trend. And I think it's important to consider that unlike the traditional diaspora, the Hayastansis have a homeland with which they sustain communication and relations on a daily basis. Whether that's through social media, whether that's through remittances, whether that's through visits multiple times a year, whether that's through following the news and so on. So I think the experience is so different. And also they're coming from the homeland, right? Versus for so many traditional diasporans, again, they're second or third diasporans and so on. So that's such a fascinating response. And the other thing I wonder if you could comment on, because this is something I've thought about as well, depending on the host society and how the host society labels or brands minorities, whether assimilation is even possible or desirable, and prestige factors, right? Like in France, everyone is French of X descent, but Frenchness is granted. In America, Americanness can be attained, and hyphens are quite acceptable, but that's not the case in every society. So I think also the host societies framing of minorities plays a
Very
role.
true. Yeah, very true. And also generational. We still have the first generation, the parents who came from Armenia to the diaspora. I'm sure second, third, and fourth generation, they most probably are going to be hyphenated Armenians in their self-definition.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. So fascinating.
Yeah.
So what other so in terms of labeling, we see that these hyphenated or combined identities are the most prominent. And what about the ingredients that make one Armenian, or the ingredients of said Armenianness? What did the survey have to say?
This is also interesting. There are some new aspects to it, which was also interesting for me. For instance, when we ask, how do you define, what are the defining elements of your Armenian identity? The top three results is family, language, and culture. Family is 82%, language is 60-some percent, culture equally. So interestingly, it's family. It's not the Armenian genocide. It's not, Armenian Christianity. We are the first nation, first Christian nation, and so on. So maybe, a couple of decades before, they might have answered differently. But today, the family is the core of your identity. And probably, it makes logical sense because, especially in the West, your first place of being exposed to the language and the culture and the food and the stories and the memories is the family. And in a lot of communities where there are no institutions or the people live far from community centers, the family is the only environment where you feel and you are Armenian.
It's so, I had years ago, so this may be 7-8 years ago, I was part of a task force for the AGBU, and one of their board members informally, so I want to say that upfront, it wasn't a research-based survey. She informally went from community to community to try to understand the ingredients. Mm-hmm. And what she presented to us, this task force for their educational programming, was family, Christianity, but culturally, and history. It was interesting.
So culture is there.
Yes.
Like in our survey is the third. So church or Christianity is part of the culture. Yeah.
Yes.
But to me, what's important is language.
Yes.
Even those who don't speak the language, they consider Armenian language as important, at least number 2 in their priority of list on the list, as part of being Armenian.
This is what I say all the time, both in its presence and absence. Mm-hmm. The Armenian language is imperative.
Yeah.
By no means does that mean I say, or I am saying that one who doesn't speak Armenian isn't Armenian or cannot be. But even in its absence, it plays a role in one's conception of Armenianness.
And I think it makes a lot of sense because, let's say, what is French? How do you define a French? Language is going to be at least one of the items, or a German. I think across cultures, language has a very important role.
I think I remember maybe an anthropology class years ago, I was taking a linguistic anthropology class, and they shared a study with us where they looked at like 3-year-old children and how they understand the concept of other. Like, this person is different from me. And it was language that marked otherness for them. This person is different because they speak a language other than me.
Yes.
So I agree with you. It's absolutely not surprising that language is an important ingredient. So,
and conversely, when non-Armenians speak Armenian fluently, we forget that they're not Armenian ethnically.
And
right?
we offered them honorary Armenian status.
But also, people are much more open in discussing, issues that they wouldn't discuss with a non-Armenian speaker.
Absolutely.
It's very interesting dynamic how that works.
Yes.
The language is like becomes like a primary unifying element in terms of this human connection. That you feel so trusting and affinity with this person because you're speaking the same language.
And also, we had poet Karen Gharslian at the Institute yesterday, and he gave a very interesting presentation on poetry, Armenian poetry across several centuries, and nationalistic themes. And then we had a very spirited debate afterwards about nationalism and so on. But even in that process, right, particularly for a stateless people like the Armenians, you've had to fall back on certain unifying elements to create a shared experience or a shared dream of a nation. And language is so central to that.
Yes.
Language is so central to the nation building project in general and to nationalisms. So it makes perfect sense that language would be
but
so
a lot
core.
of times in our discourse in community life or in Armenian discourse, we forget about the space where the language has to live and grow and become vital. So we talk about language preservation as if this is like an entity in and of itself that you can, if you do X, Y, Z, it's going to be preserved. Yes, like a museum item, it is preserved. But we must bring in the issue of the environment, the space, you know this better because you're a linguist and you're dealing with these issues day in, day out. But I think this is something that we need to bring into our discussion when we're talking about this within the community institutions.
Yes, that languages don't exist in vacuums, they exist in ecosystems.
Yeah.
And we need to nurture and invest in those ecosystems if we want Armenian-speaking youth, diasporans, and so on. Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, as the entrepreneurs would say, let's double click on language. I picked up all of this tech and entrepreneurial language from my husband. If we were to double click on this language pillar as this central node to Armenianness, what does the Armenian Diaspora Survey tell us about language dynamics across communities? And are there differences, in the kind of identifying markers you talked about, for example, differences? Are there certain universals across communities when it comes to language? And are there particular differences among communities when it comes to language? Maybe it might be easier to start with what about language did you investigate? What questions dealing with language were central to this survey?
We have the whole section on language. We ask about their fluency. We didn't define what fluency is.
I was going to ask.
Yeah, self-defined, whatever they consider fluent.
Did you ask across the 4 skills: reading, writing, speaking, listening? No, just fluency. Okay.
Fluency, because that wasn't if we had like 300 questions, we would have done that, but we had to cut and cut. So we had about fluency, but also we have a whole section on what languages did they speak with their grandparents, with their parents, and with their children. And here, again, when you look at the numbers, as I said, fluency is about 52%, the average of all 10. But if you go to Argentina or Romania, it's like less than 25% because they're Spanish-speaking or Romanian. But I'm giving you the average 52. But when you look at the generational, when you talk about the younger groups, 16 to 24, and even 25 to 34, there is a decline of the use of the language or the fluency. So the 52% is positive and concerning. It's positive that it's still, I think it's a good number. I expected less because of what we've been hearing. And so the positive is that there is still at least little over 50% fluency. We have to think about how can we increase that to 55 or 60%. The negative or the concern is that it also shows a decline, that as time goes by, we're gonna have less speakers of Armenian in the diaspora.
Well, I think particularly as the center of the diaspora shifts or has shifted from the Middle East to the West. I think the sociolinguistic environment of the West is very different than what the traditional diaspora encountered in the Middle East. And I think no group, not the traditional Middle Eastern diaspora, and particularly the Hayastansi diaspora, are prepared for the really powerful ideologies of Western countries when it comes to minority languages, minority language cultivation. If I had to guess, because this is what my research in the Los Angeles Armenian diaspora shows, the language with a generation above is more frequently Armenian, and then the generation across and below tends to go to the dominant language.
This is also the ADS results show that. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. But also, I mean, you mentioned about the Middle East, because a lot of now the communities in the West, Canada, US, the roots go to the Middle East. The roots go then to Ottoman Empire and so on. But I've also published a little bit about this, why the question, why Armenians in the Middle East are, in inverted commas, more Armenian in their feelings and language use and so on. I think sociologically, when I've thought about this, there are some important aspects of Middle Eastern life that have become conducive for this. Number one is because Armenians as Christian group, they are considered minority within Islam in the Arab countries. So the state and the society draws boundaries around your community, that this is your boundary. You cannot go beyond it.
I have to interject and say how important what you're saying is, because I get this question asked all the time, and it's asked by Armenian Americans.
Yes.
And especially my young students whose parents may or grandparents may be from the Middle East, but they don't have lived experience and they don't understand this imposed boundary from the state because they have their American experience to go by. That boundaries are drawn on both ends often, from the Armenian community, who doesn't necessarily want to assimilate, doesn't see assimilation as desirable, but also from the majority community, who sees them, and as you said so perfectly, who binds them as a minority.
They force you to be Armenian and nothing else.
Yes.
And even if you say, I don't want to be Armenian, I don't want to be Christian, in your ID card, it says you are Armenian Orthodox, Armenian Catholic. So your identity vis-a-vis the community is determined by the state. Imposed. So you have no other choice but to be, if you want to get married, the state says, go to your church and bring your license. From the church gives you marriage license. There is no civil marriage as such. So this is very important. It has its negative, obviously, but we've learned to live with this for 400 years. I mean, under Ottoman, in the Ottoman period, for 400 years, we were a minority within. But in the Middle East, so we've adapted and used this for positive, in inverted commas,
but
for the identity aspect of it.
I just want to open those brackets because in the Ottoman Empire, right, the millet system was the main procedural segmentation, let's say, right? And minorities were labeled through their religious, confessional status. And I think the Middle East inherited this system.
Yeah. And that's where the language, now coming to the language in the Middle East, the language in Islamic states is taught as the language of the religion, not as a language on its own, as a second language, or like you learn English and German and whatever. But the government allows Armenian schools to have Armenian in their curriculum, other than Lebanon, which is a little different. But in the rest of the Arab world, they teach Armenian because legally you're allowed to teach your own religion. So Armenian schools use the religion class to teach Armenian to the kids. And the government is okay with that because it's the language of the religion. So here again, the use and the teaching and the use and the production in Armenian is enhanced by state laws and society's imposition on you that you're Armenian, you're good Armenian, and keep up your religion and language.
But I want to bring an example, and I'm curious what you'll say. Here I want to address notions of prestige and superiority or inferiority, because I remember having a very interesting conversation with my pediatrician here in Los Angeles, who obviously is Armenian. She's Iranian Armenian, and she also coaches Armenian athletic teams on the side. They had gone to Armenia for this Pan-Armenian athletic competition. And she was speaking English with her athletes, and a local commented on, what kind of an Armenian team are you that you're speaking English? So as she was sharing this story, we went on to this whole conversation about language dynamics. And she said, Shushan, it is so clear for me that in Iran, we didn't want to become Persian.
Mm-hmm.
We viewed ourselves as superior. But in the US, that's not the case. It's almost the reverse. And I think I had never thought about that until she shared that. So in addition to the boundaries that would even prevent an attempt, but also there are notions of prestige within the community. And the sense I get is a lot of Middle Eastern Armenians viewed themselves, their culture, their religion, their language as superior to those of the locals.
But that's a construct.
Yes, absolutely.
That you're living in this kind of within these boundaries. Yes. It makes you feel better that, yes, we are better than anyone else and so on and so forth, because not everyone is like this kind of second-class citizens, but there are a lot of artists and scientists, all kinds of people. I always say that we say, for Armenians, îndanիկը սրբություն է. Family is sacred. You go ask a Greek person or Italian, virtually all nations consider the family sacred. We're not unique in that.
Or exceptional. We had a whole conversation yesterday about Armenian exceptionalism, and a question I posed to our guest is, isn't every nationalism built on exceptionalism?
Yeah. And somewhat rejection of the other.
Exactly.
To make it kind of exclusive.
Going back to institutions, because we were talking about Ottoman-era institutions that were inherited or continued in the Middle East, and in some cases then transported to the West. What does the Armenian Diaspora Survey say about language and Armenian schools? And how do diasporans across the globe feel about institutions that are tasked with propagating the language or preserving the language?
I think, again, this was interesting outcome in the survey about speaking of Armenian schools. At least there is desire, if not reality, for to see more Armenian schools. I mean, when we ask, would you send your child to an Armenian school, 60-some% say, yes, I would think about it. And many of them, the large portion of the respondents, they haven't gone themselves to an Armenian school. Large margin, like 3/4 haven't gone to an Armenian school, but they're saying, yes, I would think about. Now, obviously, as one of my colleagues reminded when we were talking about this, a desire is not necessarily action. So you might wish for something, but it doesn't mean that when that happens, you're going to do it. Nevertheless, at least on the conceptual level, there seems to be interest in Armenian schools, but more interest, again in the survey, on weekend or extracurricular activities in an Armenian setting for the children. There is also high demand for this, especially in smaller communities where other than the church, pretty much there is no other organization that's active.
This is, I find this so fascinating. You said 3/4 of those who participated had not attended an Armenian school. And I think for a community like Los Angeles, where we have 24 schools, people are shocked when I tell them that under 5% of school-age children in LA will ever step foot into an Armenian educational setting. Under 5%.
Yeah, wow.
But interestingly enough, what people say they will do and would like to do and what people actually do, as you so accurately noted, are quite different. And this idea of weekend schools, just from my own background in heritage language research, weekend schools are very effective for social and cultural engagement, but probably the least effective for language transmission and instruction because it's such limited time. For language, you really need time and exposure to lots of domains. But it's interesting that I think a lot of families maybe have concerns about their child not picking up the dominant language or being very proficient in English, let's say, often in the West. So they outsource things Armenian to weekend schools, which then for the children become punishment and lost social time or sleeping time and so on. These are, it's such interesting dynamics.
Another question that we ask, what do they expect the Armenian school to do?
Excellent question.
Yeah, and over 70% say to teach Armenian, which is interesting. The other top two, one is so that they engage with other Armenian students. And third, quality, they expect quality of education, overall quality. So it's very interesting that the quality is very important. The environment is interesting for them. And obviously, what is the motive to send them to Armenian school? To learn Armenian.
Even though when we've done local surveys here in Los Angeles, the language has not been even in the top 3. It's been, and again, this is at a very local level, so by no means is this representative. But in one particular Armenian day school here in Los Angeles, we did a survey 10, 15 years ago of the parents of incoming first graders. And number 1 was safe environment. Number 2 was an Armenian circle. Number 3 was quality of education. I think language was 5 or 6 on the priority list, which I found really interesting.
Probably because they were Armenian-speaking families.
Yes.
So they think that, we speak with them at home or whatever.
Yes. After looking at all of the results across the 10 countries, across the 3-4 years, what questions do you wish you had asked that never made it into the survey or had to be cut because of length? Particularly when it comes to language or education and so on. Are there questions that now looking back, you would say, I wish we had squeezed this one in?
Before saying that, related to education, one surprising result in all 10 countries that we did, that the Armenian community, in terms of education, they were higher than the society that they were living in. Because we compared this question with their country statistics in terms of education level. And in all 10 countries, the communities with studies had higher level of education than their own. So this is something interesting, but also maybe not surprising, because we as Armenians are very much believers in education, right? This is something that every grandparent, every parent will instill in you with your mother's milk. So
in all 10 countries and communities, Armenians had higher education attainment and levels than host society peers.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's quite impressive and telling.
Yeah, so this was one of the things that really hit me, that it's an interesting result.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
There are a lot of questions that we can ask. I had, obviously, by the way, I mean, the questionnaire took us like 8 months to put it together. And then every cycle, we will spend months, 4 or 5 months, try to cut it. And I should say that about maybe 20, 30% of each cycle, we have different questions. But predominantly, I think 3/4 are the same questions, because we want to keep that comparative aspect to it. I mean, and a lot of scholars and people ask, "Oh, you should have asked this and that." I say, if we were to put 500 questions, which we could have added those, but I think in the end you have to make a choice. So what we focus on is getting their views and opinions. This is not census or ethnography, as I said. Their views and opinions on 5 main themes: identity, language and culture, religion, spirituality, community engagement, and Armenia, relations with Armenia.
And how many questions total?
So, as I said, pilot was 100, and then the first cycle we did was 50. During COVID and post 44-day war of Artsakh, we had to add, you couldn't just ignore. So it became 70, 72 questions, so it was a little long. And then we went back, when we did in America and Canada, back to 50 questions. But in each cycle, we also had 3 to 5 questions that are particular to that community, which are not comparable to other communities. So we wanted to allow them to also put something that is of their own interest.
I think this mixed methodology, so the quantitative with the qualitative, is so important and so rich.
Yeah.
Because you have the survey results, but then you have these community-specific and deep dives. I have so many more questions, but I think we need several more conversations together. So do you have any final thoughts before we prep for the next engagement, which is you guest lecturing for my class? Any final thoughts you'd like to share?
I'm very excited, despite all the challenges and the problems and issues we have. I tend to be very forward-looking, and I think we have so rich of a culture, language, and I say that to do one thing Armenian every day is good enough for you to keep it vital. Call your grandmother and say parev, or read news about something Armenian. Start like that. And that's how we keep the culture and the identity vital.
I love that. My version of that is one's willingness to engage.
Mhm.
If you have willingness to engage and you can define your parameters for engagement,
Exactly.
then you're on the path.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Language Therapy with Dr. Shushan Garbetian, a podcast series from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies. This episode was produced by Dr. Garbetian, edited by Samvel Krajan, who also composed the original music. For more from the USC Institute of Armenian Studies, visit the Institute's website at armenian.usc.edu and follow the Institute on all social media platforms.